Manish and I are excited to be here. I'll let Manish introduce himself in a second. We have this device which apparently you can all text in questions, so let's try to make this interactive and as fun as possible. Manish, you want to just introduce yourself and we can go from there?
Sure. Manish Chandra, founder and CEO of a company called Poshmark, which is a mobile platform for buying and selling women's fashion. We started the company in 2011. We're doing roughly $200 million in terms of GMV run rate today, and have little over 800,000 sellers active on the platform.
That's great, and we'll get into Manish's story in a minute. I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Ashu Garg. I'm one of the general partners at Foundation Capital. We're an early stage venture capital firm, and I invest across both B2B and B2C companies, and been involved in a bunch of things that have gone public, including companies like TubeMogul and Treehouse. So Manish, why don't we start by talking about your story? How did you start Poshmark, and what was the thinking behind it?
So before Poshmark, I had a company called Kaboodle. That was sort of my entry into learning how to build communities, particularly communities around women. And the company ended up becoming a focused social shopping destination, got acquired by Hearst back in 2007. 2009, I started to see that women were trying to buy and sell fashion through that product. It was really never built for buying and selling fashion. And of course, when I turned into our own closet, there was plenty of clothes lying in with my wife's shopping bags, which were not even open yet. So between the personal experience and looking at what we were doing, it became obvious this is a big opportunity. But the opportunity really didn't become real till iPhone 4 came out in 2010. And that's when I really started to see that the technology was ready where any woman can go and quickly start to publish their closet and make it available for sale. And that's sort of how the journey started. The first person who just sort of really believed in it was actually Mayfield and Naveen Chadda. He wrote me a check very early on. And then some of my investors from Kaboodle days, Kanwal over at Inventors, Jeff Clavie at Softtech joined the consortia. And so lots of Thai connectivity and outside Thai connectivity that led to sort of the early stage formation of Poshmark.
That's a great story, Manish. I'm sure there's lots of people in the audience who are looking to raise their own sort of initial capital. Are there one or two words of wisdom or advice you would have for them?
I think there's different stages of raising capital. When you're sort of raising that first round, it's really all about your personal credibility if you don't have any metrics. Once you start to deliver metrics, then there's only one metric which matter: growth in your core KPI, which can be revenue or users or sort of accounts. And if you don't have significant growth there, then it gets harder to justify metrics. I should actually ask you, Ashu, what do you think are the key ingredients to raising money today?
Eventually when investors look at sort of funding startups, especially at the early stage, it is really a combination of two or three things. It's the person more than anything else. And Manish and I were talking about this over lunch, that, as an entrepreneur, you need to be able to think big and at the same time find a simple business. So we look for individuals who think that way, who come in with this burning desire that they're convinced that no matter what, they're going to win. And I think that desire to win is an important ingredient. And then they have to be going after a market. Almost inevitably, people evolve their business model, they evolve the metrics that are important to them, they evolve the way they succeed. And many of the most successful companies have actually been fast followers in terms of some of those things. But it's hard to evolve the core market. So you need an amazing entrepreneur in a market that you think is ripe for disruption.
Fantastic.
Manish, tell us more about, soon after you raised sort of your initial capital, you've had this tremendous growth, going from no revenues to sort of $200 million in GMV in less than 4 years. What are some of the things that you think have really worked well for you?
So, one of the things that was our core belief when we started the company is that in order to have something that really sustains and where you get mass involvement across the country and have people participate at a very broad level, it cannot be about money. And so at Poshmark, we often talk about the fact is that Poshmark is a platform built on the power of love. If you focus on love, you get money, but if you focus on money, nothing comes. And in so many ways, the insight that I had was that fashion for women is sort of a conduit of love between women. And that's sort of how the platform is built. So when we measure our core metrics, we actually have love KPIs combined with monetization KPIs. And the whole platform is structured in such a way that in order to participate in that platform, you actually have to interact with other people in a very different way than other marketplaces. So for example, the best way to actually get your first sale is not by promoting your own items, but actually engaging and promoting other people's items. That paid forward psychology starts the core formation of a community, which has scaled, and not just scaled, but actually become the foundation of a network effect and longevity that's there in the platform. So for example, one of the ways in which we analyze our business is we look at how the cohorts are behaving. So if we go back to people who joined in 2012, 2013, how are they spending both money and time on the platform? And those cohorts are not just flat, but they're actually growing over a period of time. So day one, for example, when we started the company, our average active user used to spend somewhere between 20 to 25 minutes a day. And she opened our app 7 to 9 times a day. 4 years later, or 3 years later after we launched the platform, today we have the same stat. In fact, it's gone up. It's between 8 to 10 times a day. She opens the app, she spends close to 28 minutes a day on an average across the platform. So you have to build something that is in a rhythmic way engaging, and particularly for mobile, it becomes super important. That's sort of one thing. The second thing which is we were able to do was blend offline and online. We have this notion of a virtual shopping party called a Posh Party, and that is also mapped to a physical event. So that back and forth interaction has taken a life of its own. For example, just in June, there is probably 8 or 10 events happening across the country. Only 2 of them are hosted by us. 6 or 7 are hosted by women across the country in Seattle, Nashville, Boston, etc.
Sounds like the power of the community has really been a big part of your success. Can you talk to the audience here a little bit about some of the lessons learned? Are there things that, in hindsight, you would have done differently? Especially things that you think can be generalized,
sure,
to people doing very different businesses.
I think one thing which is very core, both to Kaboodle and to Poshmark, is thinking through the team and really making sure that how you build your team is very much part of your core DNA. And team formation can be different in different places. But if you don't spend enough time forming your team, it can actually lead to breakage and issues later on. In both the startups, actually, we've had an amazing run, and most of the team, in fact, in both the teams, the core co-founders are still there 4 years after working together and doing well together. And part of it is we go through this process, which I call kitchen sink cabinet, of really working together for a few months, even before you jump into it in a wholesale kind of a manner.
That makes a ton of sense. And as you went from that founding team to now building sort of, what is a very, very substantial management team, and you've gone from being sort of, half a dozen people who started the company to having, over 100 employees, what has changed on the people side, and how have you managed that transition?
So I think scaling teams is hard, and I'm still going through that journey. So I wouldn't say that, all of the lessons are there. But part of it is the right balance of letting go as a founder, where you're sort of like really, really involved in all aspects, and at the same time, keeping a level of control on different points. And it's a progressive process, because you have to build trust, you have to build your own inner strength, and that, the faster you can do that, the faster your business scales. And I would say, if there's something I would do differently, it is really being able to let go of things faster, because that is what prevents your business from soaring.
Great. And through this journey, I'm sure you've had your own personal journey in terms of how you've evolved and grown with this. Talk to the founders here about what's gone through in your mind over the last several years.
I think my latest motto within the company and sort of in life is embrace your weirdness. I think everything that makes you strange is what makes you better. And the world actually tries to correct you. And the more you embrace your strangeness, the faster you can grow and faster you can sort of develop what you want to do. In fact, as a company, we're so different in terms of the market we play in. And part of the whole thing is building confidence in your own weirdness. That's probably sort of the biggest learning over the last 4 years, is the more we've embraced our weirdness, both as a company and as human beings, the faster we grow.
That's a great insight. Embrace your weirdness. Those who are tweeting this, that's definitely tweetable. And you should probably add the Poshmark app hashtag. We have a couple of questions from the audience here, so I'll switch to those for a few minutes. So the first question is, can you talk to the audience a little bit about what did you do that enabled you to get your initial customers, the first few thousand customers? Because you had established players like eBay who, while they're not doing what you do, are in the marketplace business for fashion in general. So how did you stand out?
So we actually followed a very different strategy. For first 6 months, so mid to 2011 till beginning of 2012, we only had 100 users or so in the app. But all 100 were using the platform for buying and selling actively. And they were all sort of handpicked. So we would actually do a physical get-together at a wine bar in Soma called District. And every week we would go there, and the goal would be to recruit 1 or 2 or 3 women to participate. My head of community and my co-founder, who's our head of merchandising, would go attend different fashion events, convince women to show up there. They'd be there. This is 2011, so a lot of people didn't have iPhones or Android phones. Our app was only iPhone. So we actually bought 40 iPods that we would give them to take home to start to take pictures and start to work with it. Initially, we would take their photos, and then one event, my co-founder came up with the idea. She said, you guys should start to photograph each other. And that's how we got them participating. And then the Posh Party idea was there, but there was no sort of technology support. So we would announce events on Facebook, and then we'd take a picture of a Post-it note, which says, party starting now, and then we would start to sort of hack it. So we hacked the first 100 users, but a lot of it was focused on engagement, because you can actually grow, but you can't build engagement after you've grown. And that's one of the follies of consumer-facing apps is you focus on growth, but if you don't have a core engaging experience, so we focused a lot on that. And then we used physical events. So actually, in January of 2012, there wasn't a lot of ways in which you could grow on mobile. So we started to throw physical parties in LA, in San Francisco, in New York. We would go there. We had a few users who would then be on local broadcasts like ABC, et cetera. And then we invite local fashion bloggers to host these events who would then publish blog entries, which both led to formation of community, but also initial growth.
That's great, and I think the insight that Manish had about, focus on engagement first before you drive growth, I think is an important one, because we see that mistake a lot, where, folks have built these massive audiences, but they're churning out just as fast as you're adding them. It's like being on a treadmill a little bit. Manish, you're also one of the rare entrepreneurs that started your career in the B2B world, and were actually very technical, sort of working in database companies and so on. And then, a few years ago, made the transition to being an entrepreneur in the B2C world. Can you talk a little bit about that transition, and what is it that you've done that enabled you to make that?
Sure. So I spent my first 10 years working for companies like Intel and Sybase, and last 10 years I've been selling women's shoes. So been two very bipolar approach to professional development. I think the big thing is that whenever you adopt a space, you got to immerse yourself, no holds barred. And you got to really, really, really just let go of all of the processes in order to do that. For example, in consumer space, it's almost antithetical to enterprise principles. Enterprise is all about productivity, making things efficient. Consumer is about tapping into your inner emotion. And productivity and efficiency actually are not very critical. Think about how much time you spend on social media. It's certainly not productive and not efficient. We can justify it in any different ways. Also, the second thing is enterprise businesses typically can talk to customers, you can get some insight. Consumer businesses, customers lie all the time. If you talk to them, you can actually get the wrong insight, because people say, I don't use Facebook, and then every 5 minutes they'll open Facebook. So you have to use data and your core insights to drive the business. So it's very, very different. You have to tap into a very different vein of your psychology. There's so many different things you have to do in order to jump across. But the biggest thing is that simple logistical thinking, which carried you in enterprise or SaaS businesses, is actually going to be antithetical. However, metrics-driven, data-driven, discipline thinking is going to be 10x more important in consumer. So it's kind of this weird thing where you're tapping into emotion one day and data on the other day. Like, for example, right in the morning, I look at probably 65 different dashboards of various trending metrics across the business. And then I'm looking at Kim Kardashian's blog. So you have to sort of do both of these things simultaneously.
And he can find a business reason to look at Kim Kardashian's blog. I need to find a better job. So, Manish, one of the audience participants has a question for you. Given as someone who was that technical and sort of, a guy in sort of in a world of women's fashion, has that been either an advantage or a disadvantage for you?
I think there's some disadvantages, but I think the fundamental advantage is that when I'm looking at a product problem, I have no personal insight. So I have to actually observe what's happening, which makes it much broader in terms of the solution rather than narrower, which is defined by your very narrow personal insight.
That's a great insight. I have a whole bunch of questions here, and I think the way I would summarize them is people are looking to, I think the audience in general is looking to understand how you're thinking about the next phase of growth. Now that you've sort of made the 0 to 100, 0 to 200 in your case, transition, how do you think of growing 10x from here, and what are some of the challenges you anticipate in doing that?
So fashion is about $1 trillion global market, $350 billion in US. So we think we have unbounded potential of growth. Just to give you some stats around Poshmark, we have almost an infinite supply that exists. We are one of the unique marketplaces where the number of buyers and sellers has remained the same even as the marketplace has scaled. Most marketplaces have a concentration of sellers, 1:20, 1:50, 1:100 ratio, sometimes 1:1,000 ratio. Ours is 1:1. It has been day one. It's been, today. Every day we have 1:1 ratio, every month, every quarter. Part of it is because the broad participation that we've been able to create on both sides. So we have infinite sellers, almost infinite demand, and then we've created a unique matching engine that allows supply and demand to come together by creating this notion of a posh stylist. So as we look at just in terms of the core market, there is infinite sort of possibilities. But what has also happened is, and it was something that we knew would happen, is our women are now not just getting stuff from their closets, but they're going out and procuring wholesale inventory, doing their own design. So 1 in 5 items on the platform today is basically in-season merchandise. 1 in 5 items both sold and inventoried. Our top sellers are now doing north of $500,000 a year in sales. So effectively what we are doing is creating a new collection of fashion boutiques, which is built on top of this mobile platform, which allows a woman to start her journey from just her closet, either just sort of rotate it, go a little bit further up and become a consignment store, or become a full-fledged fashion brand, or become their own product line. There are several brands that have been created out of Poshmark. One is called Style Mafia in Miami. Another one is Hannaberry. And these brands are now scaling out into physical world. They're actually being sold through physical boutiques. So we have what I would say is potentially creating hundreds of thousands of the nasty gals who have their own sort of brands growing on Poshmark simultaneously.
That sounds like a great opportunity ahead. Any other last words as we start to wrap up that you would have for the audience here in terms of your experiences? What do you think, what are some of the personal experiences you've had along the journey that you'd like to share?
I think my only advice would be that whatever you do, think big. I think one of the limitations of us as Indian entrepreneurs is we think small. And I always sort of encourage to think big. And you're going to hear from another guy just after it who happens to be surprisingly interesting guy, and you'll hear about thinking really big. But think of Howard Schultz, who took a coffee shop and turned it into Starbucks. So no matter what you're doing, even if you're thinking of the tiniest thing, it can become massive. And the massiveness is in your brain, not in the opportunity.
Thank you, Manish. So with that and your focus on thinking big, I'm going to thank you very much for joining us.